The Middle East is once again standing at the edge of a razor. What was once dismissed as rhetoric has now hardened into a warning, clear, deliberate, and unmistakable. Iran has declared that any U.S. military strike, limited or otherwise, will be treated as a full-scale war. This message did not come through slogans or street protests, but through a senior Iranian official speaking to Reuters against the backdrop of U.S. aircraft carrier strike groups and heavy military assets moving steadily toward the region. This time, Tehran says, there will be no room for ambiguity. No symbolic strikes, no controlled escalation, one blow, and the entire region ignites. The statement arrives at a moment when American military movement in the Middle East has drawn intense scrutiny. Satellite imagery, naval tracking data, and official Pentagon briefings confirm the repositioning of U.S. carrier groups, long-range bombers, and advanced missile defense systems. Iran claims it is watching every move closely. According to the official, while these deployments may not necessarily signal an imminent attack, Iran's armed forces are now operating at the highest level of readiness, preparing not just for deterrence, but for the worst-case scenario. Iran's position is uncompromising. The official made it clear the distinction between a limited, surgical, or preventive strike is meaningless to Tehran. Any violation of Iranian sovereignty, any breach of its territorial integrity, would automatically trigger a response at maximum capacity. This language alone has sent shockwaves across diplomatic circles because it signals a shift from strategic ambiguity to strategic absolutism. In essence, Iran is declaring that escalation control is no longer on the table. This posture dramatically increases the risk of regional spillover. The Middle East is not a chessboard with two players. It is a tightly wound network of alliances, proxy forces, energy routes, and unresolved conflicts. A U.S.-Iran confrontation would not remain confined to two capitals. It would stretch across the Persian Gulf, the Levant, Iraq, Yemen, and potentially beyond. To understand how we arrived at this moment, we must step back into the political context that has been steadily intensifying beneath the surface. Roughly 2 weeks earlier, former U.S. President Donald Trump publicly called on Iranian opposition protesters to continue their movement, stating that help is on the way. That message, broadcast globally, landed like a match thrown into dry grass. Iranian authorities claim that unrest linked to these protests has resulted in thousands of deaths, an allegation Washington disputes but does not dismiss outright. Regardless of the numbers, the political damage was already done. This episode further poisoned an already fragile U.S.-Iran relationship. Tehran interpreted Trump's remarks not as moral support, but as direct interference in its internal affairs. From Iran's perspective, this crossed a red line, reinforcing long-held suspicions that Washington seeks regime destabilization rather than behavioral change. The tension escalated further when Trump announced that a massive U.S. naval armada was moving toward Iran. Though he expressed hope that these forces would not be used, his message to Tehran was blunt. Stop killing protesters and do not restart your nuclear program. This dual warning, human rights on one hand, nuclear deterrence on the other, placed Iran in a strategic vice, intensifying pressure from multiple directions. Iran's response was swift and sharp. The senior official warned that any infringement on Iran's sovereignty would be met with retaliation. While he avoided specifying the nature of that response, the tone left little doubt. This would not be a calibrated reply. It would be decisive, overwhelming, and designed to alter the balance of power. History adds weight to Iran's fears. The Middle East has seen this pattern before. Large-scale U.S. military deployments are often framed as defensive or precautionary. Yet history shows that similar buildups have preceded major operations. In June of the previous year, the United States conducted strikes related to Iran's nuclear infrastructure after weeks of heightened military readiness. The pattern is familiar and unsettling. The precedent is not limited to the Middle East. In late last year, the United States increased its military presence in the Caribbean under the banner of counter-narcotics operations. Soon after, Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro was detained during a coordinated operation. For Tehran, these examples reinforce a core belief: American military buildup is rarely coincidental. Taken together, these events sharpen a single, unavoidable question. Will the United States rely solely on diplomatic pressure and strategic deterrence? Or is the region sliding toward open conflict? Iran's message is crystal clear. A single strike could unleash a war that engulfs the entire Middle East. The world is watching, and the next move will define not just regional stability, but the global balance of power. The current standoff cannot be understood without recognizing Iran's broader strategic doctrine. For decades, Tehran has operated under the assumption that survival depends on deterrence through resilience. Militarily weaker than the United States in conventional terms, Iran has invested heavily in asymmetric capabilities: ballistic missiles, drones, cyber warfare, and a network of allied militias across the region. These tools are designed not to win a traditional war, but to make war unbearably costly for any adversary. From Iran's perspective, the U.S. carrier groups approaching its waters are not merely defensive platforms, they are instruments of coercion. Each carrier strike group represents billions of dollars in hardware, thousands of personnel, and the capacity to project power hundreds of miles inland. For Tehran, allowing such forces to operate unchallenged near its borders signals vulnerability. Responding forcefully, therefore, becomes not just a military choice, but a political necessity. At the same time, the United States faces its own strategic dilemma. Washington seeks to deter Iran from nuclear escalation and regional aggression without triggering a broader war. The challenge lies in signaling strength without crossing Tehran's red lines. The problem is that those red lines are now deliberately blurred or erased altogether. Energy markets are already reacting. The Persian Gulf handles roughly 20% of the world's oil supply. Even the perception of conflict sends prices upward. Insurance premiums on shipping routes through the Strait of Hormuz have begun to rise, reflecting fears of disruption. For American consumers, this translates into higher fuel prices. For global markets, it signals instability. Allies are nervous. European leaders are urging restraint, emphasizing diplomacy over confrontation. Gulf states, while wary of Iran's influence, fear becoming battlegrounds in a superpower confrontation. Israel, meanwhile, is watching closely, calculating how any U.S.-Iran clash might reshape its own security environment. The situation is no longer about isolated incidents. It is about momentum. Each statement, each deployment, each warning adds pressure to a system already under strain. History teaches us that wars often begin not with grand declarations, but with miscalculations, signals misread, intentions misunderstood, reactions escalated too far, too fast. As of now, both sides insist they do not seek war, yet both are preparing for it. That contradiction is the most dangerous element of all. Looking ahead, the consequences of a direct US-Iran conflict would extend far beyond the battlefield. Militarily, Iran would likely activate its regional network immediately. US bases in Iraq, Syria, and the Gulf could become targets. Maritime traffic in the Strait of Hormuz could be disrupted through mines, missile attacks, or swarm tactics. Israel could face pressure from multiple fronts as allied groups escalate in solidarity with Tehran. For the United States, victory would not be defined by territorial gains, but by containment. The challenge would be preventing escalation while maintaining credibility. Yet credibility itself is at stake. If Washington backs down after deploying such overwhelming force, it risks signaling weakness, not just to Iran, but to rivals like Russia and China. Economically, the shock would be severe. A prolonged conflict could push oil prices well above $120 per barrel. Inflationary pressures would ripple through global supply chains already strained by geopolitical uncertainty. Developing economies would bear the brunt, but American households would feel the impact directly. Politically, a war would reshape domestic debates in the United States. Questions about interventionism, defense spending, and alliance commitments would dominate headlines. Internationally, it could fracture existing coalitions, forcing countries to choose sides in a conflict they desperately want to avoid. But there are alternative scenarios. One possibility is intensified diplomacy behind closed doors. Back-channel negotiations, mediated by neutral actors, could allow both sides to step back without losing face. Another scenario involves a limited exchange, short, sharp, and carefully managed, designed to re-establish deterrence without triggering total war. This, however, is the riskiest path, because it relies on perfect calibration in an imperfect world. There is also the possibility of prolonged tension without direct confrontation. In this scenario, military assets remain deployed, rhetoric remains heated, but both sides avoid the first strike. This cold conflict would still carry costs, economic, psychological, and political, but might be seen as preferable to open war. The most dangerous outcome remains accidental escalation. A misfired missile, a naval incident, or a rogue actor could ignite a chain reaction beyond the control of decision-makers in Washington or Tehran. History is filled with wars that began not by design, but by error. Ultimately, this crisis is a test of leadership. It will measure whether power is exercised with restraint, whether deterrence can coexist with diplomacy, and whether lessons from past conflicts have truly been learned. Iran has drawn its line in bold ink. The United States must now decide how close it is willing to step. One strike, Iran warns, and the Middle East could burn. The world waits, not just for action, but for wisdom.